talks about Electronic Instruments Inc., they found that 30% of their products were bringing in a whopping 67% of their profits.
That's huge.
Yeah, and this helped them make some big strategic shifts, focusing on those high-performing products.
So they were able to make smarter decisions about where to put their resources because they understood which products were their real bread and butter.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about relationships with customers? Does this principle apply there too?
Absolutely. Think about it. It's likely that 80% of a company's profits come from just 20% of their customers.
Interesting.
And Koch really stresses how important it is to figure out who those top clients are and then make sure you're keeping them happy.
Okay, so how do you actually do that? Is it about giving them like special treatment, discounts, or something else?
Well, there's a great quote in the book from a consultant who was advising on building a super successful insurance agency. And he said the key was outrageous service to the top 20% of clients.
Outrageous service.
Yeah.
I like the sound of that. But wouldn't that take a ton of extra work? Be super expensive? How is that even practical?
It's not about being like over the top or wasteful. It's about going above and beyond to really wow them and build that loyalty.
Okay.
Think about it. Keeping an existing customer happy is much easier and way more profitable than constantly trying to find new ones.
That's a good point. So by really focusing on those key relationships, you create a win-win for both the company and the customer.
Exactly. And this 80/20 thinking, you can use it for so many other areas of business too, from marketing to like team management.
Okay, I'm starting to see the potential here, but I got to ask, is this just another business buzzword? Or can it actually help me improve my own WN life?
That's where it gets really exciting because this 80/20 principle, it's not just for business. It's a way of understanding how the world works.
Yeah.
And yes, it can absolutely help you personally.
All right, I'm all ears. Tell me more about how this can help me achieve more and maybe even be happier.
Well, let's start with how you spend your time. Are you always truly happy and productive?
Yeah.
Or are those like peak moments of joy and achievement, are they really concentrated in certain activities or with certain people?
You know what? You're totally right. There are definitely times when I feel like I'm in the zone, time flies by, and I'm just crushing it.
Exactly. And those are your happiness and achievement islands, as Koch calls them.
Happiness Islands. I love that.
The idea is those islands, they represent the 20% of your time that's giving you 80% of your happiness and results.
Okay, so how do I find more of these islands? It's not like they come with a map, right?
It starts with paying attention, being mindful. Think about those times when you're totally absorbed in what you're doing, time just disappears, and you're doing your best work.
Okay, I think I get it. It's like finding those flow states.
Exactly. And once you've found them, the trick is figuring out how to spend more time on them. You might have to delegate some things, get rid of distractions, even change how your day is structured.
You know, now that you mention it, I can think of a few things I could probably delegate. I'm definitely guilty of trying to do it all.
And that's a trap we all fall into. We often think we have to do everything ourselves, but really there are often people around who would love to help.
That's true. But it's hard to let go of control sometimes.
I get it, but think of it this way. By letting go of those tasks that just drain you and don't bring you joy, you free up more time and energy for the things that truly matter.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, so it's less about working harder and more about working smarter.
I like that. So that's the heart of Koch's time revelation, right? He's not saying to become a workaholic. He's saying to create a life that's really aligned with what you value. Yeah, that's a vision I can get behind. But are there actually people who live this way? It all sounds so idealistic.
Oh, for sure. Koch shares examples of people who've really mastered this, and they're not all, living off the grid. He talks about William Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, who was super productive but had a very unconventional schedule.
A time-bending prime minister. Okay, tell me more.
Well, even with one of the most demanding jobs, Gladstone always made time for his passions, like travel and theater and reading.
So he's proof you can achieve big things without sacrificing your personal life.
Exactly. And Koch also profiles successful business leaders who, even though it seemed like they were working all the time, they weren't. They were just really strategic about their time, focused on the high-value stuff, and delegated the rest.
So it's not about how many hours you put in. It's about how you ease those hours.
Absolutely, which is empowering because it means we all have the potential to create more time freedom in our lives, no matter what our jobs or commitments are.
Okay, I'm definitely feeling inspired. But let's be real. Making this time revolution happen probably takes a pretty big mindset shift, right?
For sure, it's about being willing to challenge those old norms and really create a lifestyle that supports your goals and values.
So it's about designing a life that reflects who you are and what you want to do.
Exactly. And that leads us to another big part of a fulfilling life, financial freedom.
Ah, money. I think we can all agree that having a healthy relationship with money is important. So how does the 80-20 principle fit in here?
Koch argues that the key to building wealth is to focus on passive income, the kind that's not tied to the hours you work.
Okay.
He believes that money grows much faster through investments than through a traditional job.
I get that, but I'm no financial genius. How does someone who's not an expert even get started with investing?
Well, Koch gives really clear, practical advice on how to start, even if you're a total beginner. He encourages people to invest mainly in the stock market, focusing on long-term growth. He even lays out what he calls the 10 commandments of investment.
10 commandments of investment. That sounds intense.
Well, he's emphasizing how important it is to be strategic and disciplined with your investments, and also aligning your approach with your personality and how much risk you're comfortable with.
So it's not about blindly following the crowd. It's about creating a strategy that works for you.
Exactly. He even suggests that you can use your existing expertise and interests to inform your investment decisions.
So if you're passionate about something like, I don't know, renewable energy, you could invest in companies doing that. That's a pretty cool idea.
It is. You get to align your investments with your values, which can be super motivating.
Okay, I see how this all ties together. But what about those of us who are still working towards financial freedom? Are there any 80-20 principles we can apply to our careers?
Absolutely. Koch has a whole chapter on this, and he argues that we should focus on becoming really, really good at a few key skills that are in high demand.
So instead of being a jack of all trades, be a master of a few.
Right. And he encourages people to find those skills that are both in demand A&D that they genuinely enjoy.
That's a good combo. So finding that sweet spot where your passions and skills meet. But how do you actually figure out what those skills are?
It starts with being honest with yourself about what you're good at naturally and what you actually enjoy doing.
So paying attention to those times when you're in the zone and work feels effortless and fulfilling.
Exactly. And once you've identified those skills, the key is to really hone them, become an expert.
So it's about investing in your own professional development.
Exactly. And here's the interesting part. As you become more skilled and knowledgeable, you'll naturally start to attract more opportunities and better paying clients.
So by focusing on those key skills, you're actually setting yourself up for more success and abundance.
Precisely. And this principle, it also applies to how we network and build relationships in our industries.
Networking. Not my favorite thing, but I know it's important. How can we use the 80-20 principle to make it less painful and more effective?
Well, Cox says we should focus on building strong relationships with just a small number of key influencers in our field.
So it's quality over quantity when it comes to networking.
Exactly. He suggests we find those people who are well-connected, respected, and who share our values and goals.
I could see how that could make networking feel less transactional and more, well, meaningful.
Right. And by nurturing those key relationships, you're building a network of support and opportunity that can really help you grow in your career.
So it's about building a tribe of like-minded people who can help you succeed.
Exactly. And you know what? This principle even applies to our relationships outside of work.
Okay, I'm curious, how does that work?
Cox suggests that a small number of our relationships, like our closest friends and family, contribute the most to our happiness and well-being.
That makes sense. So it's about prioritizing those relationships that really nourish us.
Exactly. This doesn't mean neglecting our other relationships, just being mindful of where we invest our time and energy.
Okay, I get it. But what about those relationships that are draining? What do we do about those?
That's a great question, and it's something we can talk more about in the next part of our deep dive.
Looking forward to it. We've covered so much ground, from business and time management to investing in relationships. It's amazing how this one principle can apply to so many things.
It really is. It's a framework for understanding how the world works and for making better choices about how we live.
And it's not about deprivation or restriction. It's about focusing on what matters most and letting go of the rest.
Exactly. It's about creating a life full of joy, purpose, and abundance.
Okay, I'm feeling super inspired. But before we get too carried away, let's bring it back to the book. Are there any other key takeaways that we haven't talked about yet?
Well, one of the most intriguing parts of the book is how Koch looks at applying the 80-20 principle to competitors.
Okay, this is where it gets tricky for me. It's one thing to use it in our own lives, but how do we use it to understand, like, the whole competitive landscape?
He argues that instead of just focusing on WHO your competitors are, you should really be analyzing how they're dividing up the market. He calls these competitive segments like slices of the pie.
So instead of looking at traditional business categories, you're saying we should look at how competitors are carving things up and see where we fit in.
Exactly. He tells this story about an instrumentation company where the management team was having trouble analyzing their business. Some were focused on products, others on customers, others on regions. But when they started analyzing their business based on these competitive segments, things got much clearer.
I see. So they found a better way to understand their strengths and weaknesses by looking at the market through the lens of their competitors.
Exactly. And once you've identified those segments, you can use the 80-20 principle to figure out where to focus your efforts. This company, they made a matrix to categorize their segments by profitability and how attractive the market was.
So they were able to prioritize, go after those segments with the most potential.
Right. And this helped them make tough choices, like cutting back on time spent on less profitable areas,
Right.
even getting out of some segments that were losing money.
That's a great example of how the 80-20 principle can help businesses make smarter choices about where to invest.
Now, switching gears a bit, Koch also talks about using the 80-20 principle for personal development, and one area he gets into is relationships.
Yeah. We talked about those key relationships that support us, but what about the ones that, well, maybe aren't so great? The ones that drain us.
That's a great point. And Koch recognizes that not all relationships are equal. He says, just like in business, we should be thoughtful about where we put our energy in our personal lives, too.
So he's not saying to just cut people off,
Right.
but to be more aware of how we're interacting with them.
Exactly. He encourages us to focus on those relationships that are truly good for both people.
Okay, so being intentional, like with our time and money.
Right. Now, another fascinating area is how Koch applies this to creativity and problem solving.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. How do we use this to be more creative, better problem solvers?
He argues that most breakthroughs don't come from just grinding away, but from those moments of inspiration that seem to pop up out of nowhere.
So it's not just about effort, it's about creating the right environment for those aha moments.
Exactly. He says we can actually encourage these moments by trying new things, experimenting, letting our minds wander a bit.
So instead of forcing solutions, be open to exploring and let our subconscious do some work.
Precisely. He even suggests using the 80-20 principle to figure out what activities or environments spark our creativity.
So if I know I get my best ideas walking in nature, I should make time for that.
Exactly. It's about creating a lifestyle that helps you be your most creative self.
Okay, I'm really seeing how this principle can fit into different parts of our lives.
Mhm.
But before we wrap up, let's go back to something you mentioned earlier, the potential downsides of the 80-20 principle.
Good point. We haven't really talked about that. It's important to remember that while this principle is powerful, it's not magic, and there are some things to watch out for.
So what are some things to be careful about?
Well, one danger is being too strict with the 80-20 principle. It's a guideline, not a rule set in stone. There will always be exceptions.
So be flexible, don't be afraid to go off script when it makes sense.
Exactly. Another thing is we can't completely ignore the other 80%. We focus on the vital few, but we can't just forget the rest.
So finding a balance, right? Focusing on the essential without neglecting those other important tasks.
Precisely. And lastly, the 80-20 principle isn't an excuse to be lazy or cut corners.
It's about working smarter, not less.
Right. It's about being strategic, making every effort count, focusing where we can make the biggest difference.
We've covered a lot today, from the history of the 80-20 principle to how it's used in business, time management, investing, relationships, even creativity. And we've talked about some things to watch out for.
It has been quite a journey. Hopefully our listeners feel ready to start using this in their own lives.
I know I am. I feel like I have a whole new perspective and some great strategies to try out.
Remember, it's not about trying to do everything. It's about finding those few key areas where you can have the biggest impact and putting your energy there.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the 80-20 principle, I want you to think about where you can use this in your own life. Where can you streamline, maximize your impact, and create a life that truly reflects your values and goals?
Until next time, happy exploring. You know, one of the most interesting things Koch talks about is how the 80-20 principle can be applied to thinking about competitors.
Now, this is where it gets a little tricky for me. It's one thing to apply this principle to our own lives, but how can we use it to, make sense of the competitive landscape out there?
Well, Koch argues that instead of just focusing on who your competitors are, you should be analyzing how they're dividing up the market. He uses the term competitive segments, sort of like slices of a pie.
Oh, okay. So we're not looking at those traditional business categories. We're looking at how our competitors are carving up the market, and then we try to figure out where we fit into that picture.
Exactly. He tells this great story about an instrumentation company. The management team was having a hard time analyzing their business.
I can imagine that gets pretty complex.
Yeah. Some people were focused on products, others on customer types, others on geographic regions. But when they looked at their business through the lens of competitive segments, it all became much clearer.
So they gained a better understanding of their strengths and weaknesses by looking at the market from their competitor's point of view. That's smart.
Right. And once you've identified those segments, you can then use the 80/20 principle to figure out where you should really focus your efforts.
I see where this is going.
In this example, they actually created a matrix to categorize their competitive segments. They looked at things like profitability and how attractive each market was.
So they were able to prioritize, put their energy into those segments that had the most potential. Makes sense.
And this helped them make some difficult decisions. Like they had to cut back on management time spent on those less profitable segments. They even exited some areas that were losing money.
Tough choices, but probably the right ones in the long run. It's a good example of how using this principle can help businesses be more strategic about where they
Koch also talks about the 80/20 principle and personal development.
Okay.
And one area he dives into, which we touched on earlier, is relationships.
Right. We talked about nurturing those key relationships, the ones that bring joy and support. But what about the other side of that coin? What about the relationships that maybe aren't so good for us, the ones that drain our energy?
That's a great question. And Koch acknowledges that not all relationships are created equal. Just like in business, we need to be mindful of how we invest our time and energy when it comes to personal relationships.
So he's not saying to just cut people out of our lives completely.
Not necessarily. It's more about being more deliberate, more conscious about how we engage in those relationships.
Got it. So it's about intentionality.
Hmm.
Just like with time management and finances, we have to be intentional with our relationships.
Exactly. Another really fascinating area where Koch applies this principle is thinking about creativity and problem solving.
Okay, this is where I get really interested. How do we use this to boost our creativity, to become better problem solvers? I think a lot of people struggle with that.
Well, Koch argues that those breakthrough moments, they don't usually come from just putting in more hours. They tend to come from those flashes of insight, those aha moments that seem to appear out of thin air.
So it's not about just grinding it out. It's about creating the right environment for those moments to happen.
Right. And he suggests that we can actually create those conditions for inspiration. Things like exposing ourselves to new ideas, experimenting, giving our minds some space to wander.
So instead of trying to force ourselves to come up with the perfect solution, we should be more open, explore possibilities, and let our subconscious mind work on the problem a bit.
Exactly. He even suggests that we can use the 80/20 principle to pinpoint the activities or environments that spark our creativity.
So, for example, if I realize I get my best ideas when I'm out in nature or maybe listening to music, I should make sure to incorporate those things into my routine.
That's the idea. It's about designing a lifestyle that actually supports your creativity, a lifestyle that allows you to reach your full potential.
I love that. Okay, we've talked about so many different applications of this principle, from business and time management to relationships and creativity. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier, the potential downsides of applying the 80/20 principle.
You're right. It's important to acknowledge that while it's a very powerful tool, it's not perfect. There are definitely some potential traps to watch out for.
Okay, so what are some things we need to be careful about?
Well, one potential danger is becoming too rigid, too inflexible in applying the 80/20 principle. We have to remember that it's a guideline, not a rigid set of rules. There will always be situations where it doesn't perfectly apply.
Right, so we need to be flexible, adaptable, maybe even deviate from the 80/20 formula when it makes sense.
Exactly. And another potential pitfall is neglecting the remaining 80%. It's crucial to focus on those vital few, but we can't completely ignore everything else.
It's about finding that balance, isn't it? Focusing on the essential tasks while also acknowledging the importance of those other, maybe less impactful activities.
Precisely. And last but not least, it's really important to remember that the 80/20 principle is not an excuse to be lazy or to take shortcuts.
It's about working smarter, not necessarily less, right?
Exactly. It's about being intentional, strategic, and making sure that our efforts are focused on the areas where we can create the biggest impact.
Well, I feel like we've covered so much ground today. We've explored the history and evolution of the 80/20 principle. We've looked at how it can be applied in various areas of our lives, from business and time management to investments, relationships, even creativity. And we've discussed some of the potential pitfalls to watch out for. It's been a really insightful conversation.
It has. And I hope our listeners feel inspired and equipped to start applying this principle in their own lives.
That's the goal. And I have to say, I'm walking away from this conversation with a renewed sense of clarity and purpose. It feels like I've gained some really valuable tools and strategies that I can put into action right away.
And remember, it's not about trying to do everything perfectly. It's about finding those few key areas, those 20% activities, where you can make the biggest difference. Focus your energy there, and you'll be amazed at what you can accomplish.
That's such a great reminder. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the 80/20 principle, I want to encourage everyone listening to think about where you can apply this powerful concept in your own life. Where can you simplify, maximize your impact, and create a life that truly aligns with your values and goals? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.